One opening that I've been encountering quite a lot lately is one that I actually made a video about a couple of months ago, and it usually starts in the Sicilian, and it goes like this: e4, c5, and b4. Well, I have been looking at this a little bit. Obviously, like I said, I made a video about it earlier, but now that I'm working on my game again, I just felt like taking a second look at this. First of all, it's not a bad opening. I know that a lot of people think that, oh, this or that opening is so immensely bad and you're immediately better, blah, 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 you know. It's not quite that simple, actually. If you've seen that video, you will unless, of course, you already know what this opening is about. White plays b4 because he simply wants to have a stronger center here. So, for example, if the main move c takes b4, White can play a3 or d4. D4 is probably what I've seen the most over the board, but a3 is definitely something you need to keep an eye on. So let's start with d4 because I think this is probably the most practical move. And here I would probably play d5. And again, just to refer to practice, usually I would say 10 out of 10, maybe at least 9 out of 10 of my opponents play e5 here. Because if you go d4, you probably don't want to take on d5, even though again it's definitely an okay move. It's even part of opening theory and probably, at least in my book, the second most common move. But e5. Okay, so it reminds a little bit of the French defense, except that black doesn't have a c-pawn because that c-pawn has been traded off for a b-pawn, and black has double pawns on the b file. But you're already up a pawn, so there's no reason to worry too much about that. So either you can play knight to c6 here or bishop f5. It's basically... But I wouldn't recommend e6, because if you play e6, then this bishop becomes bad, and it's difficult to get it out somewhere. So you will probably have to play, I don't know, b6, a5 or something like that, and then play bishop a6, just like you would have to do in the French defense. So it's probably better to play bishop f5 or knight to c6. Knight to c6 is fine. If a3 here, which is again the main move, I think I mentioned that in my previous video that queen b6 is a good move here, because, well, first of all, if white takes, this pawn d4 is hanging, so white has to play bishop e3. He could go knight e2 here as well, but I think bishop e3 is the most common move. We'd also developed a piece here on the queen side, and here we can just go bishop f5. And if you take a look at the main moves here, white can play either knight f3 or bishop d3. So here you just take, and e6. It's okay to go a takes b4 as well, but then you can either take with the bishop check, but then c3, or knight takes b4, and the queen has to go. But c3 is anyway a move that white wants to play. So for example, if a takes b4 and bishop takes b4, then it's not. This is actually not part of opening theory. Then just c3, and this is just a move black wanted to play anyway. So you might just as well take with the queen and to give a check, or even better to take with a knight. And well, you're threatening his queen, so he has to go to, I don't know, just e2 perhaps. And the problem here, well, there are basically two things in this opening for black that can be seen as a problem. One is this knight. Well, okay, you could say two basically, because you don't really know where to put this bishop, and you also don't really know where to put this knight. So knight to e7 is more or less forced, and here comes c3, and this is actually something I have never played myself, but at least according to my book, black sacrifices this knight with knight to f5, and if it takes, you play bishop takes b4, and it looks like black has won a couple of pawns. So for example, obviously if you go down with this bishop, you would just take this pawn with the queen. So probably you will have to play something like this. And you can still win a pawn, but I'm not so sure if that's such a great idea. Maybe you can, maybe you don't. Let's say you play this and you go here, for example. If you take this knight with check, he probably takes with the queen. So it looks like you're almost forced to play this move. What else? Okay, so for example, I mean, I'm just speculating here right now. I haven't analyzed this. But anyway, so that's part of opening theory. I don't know if I would play that myself, but so do whatever you want. You can either play knight f5, giving up this knight, or just move it away, for example, to c6 or something. So let's go back. Okay, I mentioned that also c takes b4. What I've been seeing the most is d4, but the main move is actually a3. And I think d5 is the best here. White could again go e5. If e5, then just knight to c6, d4, and again queen b6. So we can transpose into the same line all the time. So for example, if e takes d5, queen takes d5, a takes b4, it would be a mistake, or it is actually part of opening theory, but I really can't figure it out. For example, if a takes b4, queen e5 check, queen e2, and then just take the rook here, queen c4 and bishop d7. And queen b3, queen e5 check. I mean, to my mind, black is just down a rook for nothing, so I don't really see the point with that. So queen takes d5, knight f3. e5 is a move, but I think e5 leads to rather complicated stuff that I'm not going to get into. I think personally I would play something like either bishop g4 or knight to c6, or maybe even knight f6. If a takes b4, you can also give the pawn back. That's an alternative, but I'm not so sure if that would be the best. But you could try and develop here like e6, knight c3, queen d8, knight b5, knight c6, c3. It looks a little bit ugly, I think. Let's see, 6 pawns against 6. If you don't want to give the pawn back, let's see here. Knight f6 is not very often played, so what's so horribly wrong about that? So for example, what if you play e5 here? This is also out of book, probably a bad move, I don't know. Maybe queen e2. e5 is probably not good. So perhaps knight f6 after all, even though it is part of opening theory, it's not very good. So you can also go knight to c6 perhaps. Bishop e2, knight to f6, c4, b takes, knight takes, queen d8. I think if you manage to get out of this, you will definitely have a better game with the black pieces. That's my opinion. Yeah. I mean, first of all, you're up a pawn, and then white has this rather weak pawn on d2 at this moment. So let's take another look. So a3 is played very often. You can also see something like bishop b2, but I think it's safer to just look at the main moves. Again, e6 is fine. I have played e6 myself many times. Takes, c3, bishop e7, d4 probably, yeah. You don't want... I don't think d5 is a good move, because if you play d5 you will have not a very pleasant variation of the French defense. I think d6 makes most sense. But then f4 perhaps, knight f6, e5 can be tried. You can take, you can also play knight d5. If knight d5, c4 is a move, but it starts looking a little bit like white is overextending his pawns, so I don't know, knight b6, he takes, bishop f6. This is opening theory, but I was looking at what happens if this move. I don't know. Well, obviously you're forced to do that, because if you take with the queen, it's the same thing. You have, and also if bishop take, again, c5. So how did you get into this mess in the first place? e5. So you want to avoid that, you just take the pawn. F takes e5. Knight e5. Queen g4. King f8. You don't want to castle, obviously, because if you castle here, then just bishop h6, and you're going to have to give up your rook for the bishop, because it's going to be checkmate otherwise. So g6 takes. Well, I'm not going to get into that. So king f8 actually. Knight f3, knight c6. Well, I think black is rather cramped here. c4 is a threat, perhaps. Maybe not right now, but it could be. Black has lost his rise to castle, and he has to untangle himself somehow. Maybe g6, well, not right now perhaps, but h5, I don't know, g6, just something. But then also bishop d3 castles. I think white would have a rather serious attack here on the king's side, and once there's a rook on f1, you know, it doesn't look very pleasant. So one has to figure out these things, how to avoid them. So you played, well, bishop takes b4 here. So instead of that, instead of e6, now we can see why d5 is probably the best move here. And if he takes d5, queen takes d5, knight f3, e5, a takes b4, bishop takes b4, c3, bishop e7, knight a3. a6 would be a very nice move to play, but it's not possible because it doesn't make any difference. If a6, you can play knight b5 anyway, because there is no a takes b5, because there's a rook hanging on a8. So a6 is actually a move, but it doesn't stop knight b5, so it doesn't make much sense to play it in the first place. So knight to c6, knight b5, he has to go to d8, d4. e4 is a move. What would happen if the e4? Then d5, you takes. Okay, I was looking at this move. B takes e6, queen takes f3, bishop d7, knight d4. Looks kind of messy. I'm really trying hard to find something useful here that is can be seen as good. There has to be something here. You can also play bishop takes a3, but I don't know. How about knight f6? But then it probably goes to b5 anyway. Queen d8 again. Okay, then you lose a pawn, obviously. Bishop d7. Bishop c4. Queen e4. Bishop e2 or king f1. What take? Castle. Rook e1. Bishop a4. d3. Well, here you can just exchange. Maybe black is fine here. I don't know. Okay, I will end this video by simply saying that perhaps bishop d7 is better than knight c6. I don't know. At least it looks like that. So bishop d7, bishop c4, check. If not bishop c4, I mean this is just huge. One has to. Okay, bishop c4 is actually the main move here. Queen e4. White can also go king f1, but I think it makes more sense to play this. And then you develop your knight, you castle like we saw, and then you also castle. Rook e1 and bishop a4. Is it well, he's forced to play d3. And then we just saw this trade, and I think black has equalized. Maybe this pawn is a little bit weak on e5 now that I'm looking at it. Or maybe not. Because, yeah. Okay. I hope this made any sense. So just to wrap this up, so we have the b4 move in the Sicilian. And before I close, b4 can also be played after the normal moves. Knight f3, d6, and here b4. You know, you just play the same way. d4, knight f6 perhaps, or d5 is a move, but I think knight f6 is fine enough. Bishop d3, d6. I think the idea is that you probably want to avoid some kind of bad French defense variation or something, because this bishop is still here, and you know, and this, and we saw these three pawns, c3, d4, and e5. That's not very pleasant for black. Okay, if you have something to add to this discussion, feel free to comment.